In this video, we're going to look at a historically important argument from Descartes for dualism and against physicalism. So, physicalism is a family of theories claiming that everything is fundamentally physical. Two versions of it are the mind-brain identity theory that says the mind just is this special physical object, the sort of brain, not just any brain, but one that's sort of living and sort of working. And then there's functionalism as it's usually developed that says that the mind just is the function or programs maybe that physical things like the brain run, even though other physical things might also be able to run those same programs. So earlier we discussed this idea that there seems to be a strong correlation between physical states and mental states. Well, wouldn't that show that the mind just is a physical thing, such as the brain, perhaps? Well, no, not necessarily. Consider an example. Imagine that we sort of do some brain scans and we discover that every time someone feels pain, they have sort of C fibers firing in their brain. One explanation for why you always see that correlation would be the physicalist explanation where you say, well, the reason whenever C fibers fire, you feel pain is because feeling pain just is the physical state of those C fibers firing. However, there's competing explanations for why these are correlated that a dualist could accept. The dualist could say maybe these two things are correlated because that physical state causes the non-physical pain experience. Or they might be correlated because maybe the physical state and the pain experience have a common cause. So for instance, stubbing your toe might simultaneously cause the physical state of C fiber stimulation and the non-physical pain experience. So even though they're two distinct things, you always see them happen together because they're both caused by the same thing. Now, the difference between physicalism and dualism then is best understood as a difference regarding what's possible. So if the identity theory is true, it's not just that the physical state and the mental state are perfectly correlated. Rather, it would be impossible for the mind to exist without the brain since they are one and the same thing. It's not just that you never do get them separated, it's that it's impossible for them ever to be separated. Now, if dualism is true, even if, as a matter of fact, the mind and brain are perfectly correlated for whatever reason, dualism says since they're two different things, it's at least possible for the mind to exist without the brain. Notice that doesn't mean that that's ever going to happen. Dualism does imply that it's possible for the mind to exist without the brain. It's possible for certain mental states to exist without the brain. But dualism does not say that that's ever actually going to happen. In the same way, look, in some sense, it's possible for a person to fly in the sky above the earth like Superman. However, there exist certain rules or physical laws in our world that prevent it from happening. The law of gravity prevents it from happening. Similarly, even if in some sense it's possible for the mind to exist without the body, there might be certain laws governing the two, such that when you maybe take the sort of physical brain out of existence, maybe there's a law that sort of causes the non-physical mind to also be destroyed. So, a perfect correlation between the mind or mental states and the brain and physical states doesn't prove whether it's possible or impossible for one to exist without the other. And so those perfect correlations don't sort of prove for certain whether physicalism is true or whether dualism is true. So if we want to figure out if physicalism is true or if dualism is true, we need to figure out more than whether or not you always see the mind correlate with physical states. We need to figure out whether it's possible for them to be separated in some way. But if what actually happens doesn't decide what's possible or impossible, what kind of evidence could we get that something's possible or impossible? A common suggestion appeals to what you might call a conceivability test. The idea is if we can conceive of a certain situation S, then S is possible. So even if it's never happened and even if it never will happen, the idea is if we can conceive or imagine of that situation, that thereby gives us evidence that that is a possible situation. But if we try to conceive of something and fail, if we cannot conceive of a certain situation, then that shows not only that it doesn't happen, but that it's impossible for it to happen. So let's consider some examples to see how this would work. Is it possible for there to be a 100-foot tall copy of Descartes' Meditations? The answer here seems to be yes. But how do you know? Have you ever seen one? Do you have any reason to believe that there's ever been one? Have you ever heard of anyone saying that someone's built one? Do you have any reason to believe that someone's going to build one? I mean, I highly doubt that anybody's ever going to create a 100-foot tall copy of Descartes' Meditation. But even if one has, so even if this book has and never will exist, this 100-foot copy, we could still imagine or conceive of a 100-foot tall copy of the book. And the fact that we can imagine or conceive of it gives us reason to believe that even if it's never going to be true, it's still possible. Well, is it possible for a human being to jump over a skyscraper on Earth in a single jump without assistance of any kind of machine, like a jetpack? The answer here is yes, it seems. Now, wait, you might be thinking, what? That's not possible. I've tried a bunch and I can't jump over buildings in a single leap. Well, notice this has never happened. We have good reason to think that it never will happen. But why do we have reason to think that nobody's ever going to actually do this? Because the law of gravity that we know about prevents this from happening. But notice, it seems to be possible that the law of gravity was different than it is. So the laws of physics didn't have to be exactly how they are. We can imagine them being different. And so we can conceive of a situation where gravity works differently than it does here. And if gravity were to work differently, well, then people would sometimes jump over a skyscraper in a single jump. So what we might say is that this jump is physically impossible. So it's ruled out by the laws of physics that we actually have. But it's not absolutely impossible, since we could have had. It's possible that there be different laws of physics than the ones that we actually have. So what about this, though? Is it possible for there to be a married bachelor? Here the answer seems to be no. Now look, even if one never happens to exist, so I mean, I've never run into a married bachelor and I don't think I ever will. But the fact that I never run into one doesn't mean that it's absolutely impossible. So how do I know that it's impossible for there to ever be a married bachelor? Well, when we think carefully about what a married bachelor would be, we realize that it would be a married, unmarried adult male person. And that's just a contradiction. A married bachelor is literally inconceivable. Thus, we know that this isn't just something that doesn't exist. We know that the existence of a married bachelor is impossible. So what about a round square? Is it possible for there to be a round square? And again, the answer seems to be no. Now, even if there never was and never will be a round square, though, notice that by itself doesn't prove that it's impossible for there to be one. Just like the fact that a 100-foot copy of Descartes' Meditation never has and probably never will exist doesn't prove that this is impossible. So how do I know that not only that a round square doesn't exist, but that it's impossible for one to exist? Because when we try, we realize that a round square is literally inconceivable. You cannot even imagine a round square. Now you might be saying, wait, what do you mean we can't imagine or conceive of a round square? You might be saying, I'm imagining one right now. Now, is what you're imagining something like this? Because if you are, notice that's not imagining a round square. What I've drawn here is something that looks similar to a square, but it's not a square. It has these rounded corners, but as soon as I round those corners, it's no longer a square. And so once you realize that, you'll see, okay, if by round square you mean something that is both literally a square, meets the definition of a square, and has like round edges, well, then you see, okay, I can't imagine that. I can only imagine something that's sort of in between the two. So Descartes begins his defense of dualism by trying to give us a clear conception of our ideas of mind and body. So according to Descartes, what makes something mental is that it has thought. And what makes something physical is that it has extension. And so Descartes is thereby providing us with a way to distinguish between our ideas of mind and body in the way that we sort of think about them. He then turns to giving an argument that minds or thinking things are not also part of physical reality or extended things. In other words, he's attempting to establish that there's a distinction not only between our ideas of mind and body, but that there's a distinction between these two things outside of our ideas of them. In other words, the mind and body are two distinct parts or aspects of the world we live in. So he's attempting to establish dualism. So Descartes gives an argument for this that we might call the conceivability or disembodiment argument. Here's an overview of that argument. It says, we can conceive of a situation where our mind exists without our physical body or brain. If we can conceive of something, then it's at the very least possible. So, it's possible for our mind to exist without our physical body or brain. But if the mind just was the physical body or brain, then it would be impossible for our mind to exist without our physical body or brain. Thus, the mind is not identical to the body, or specifically the brain. So now notice, premise 3 here is actually an intermediate conclusion that is being supported by premise 1 and premise 2. All right, so this is a modus ponens argument where it says, if we can conceive of something, then it's possible. Then it says we can conceive of mind without body. And so it concludes, so it is possible for mind to exist without body. Now, the actual conclusion is being supported by premise 3 and premise 4. Yet again, in this case, it's a modus tollens argument. It says, if the mind just was the body, then it'd be impossible for the one to exist without the other. But as we've already tried to establish, Descartes thinks it is possible for one to exist without the other, and so he concludes that they are not the same thing. All right, so notice the green parts of this argument are conclusions that are meant to be supported by other sort of premises, and the argument that goes from premise 1 and 2 to 3 is a valid argument. The argument that goes from 3 and 4 to the conclusion 5 is also a valid argument. And so really what this argument depends on is, are premises 1, 2, and 4, the premises in yellow, are those true? What reason do we have to believe them? Are there any reasons to doubt them? That's where sort of all the action, so to speak, happens. All right, so let's look at premise 1. It says that we can conceive of a situation where our mind exists without our body or brain. Why should we think that's true? Well, your ability to think about Descartes' example of the evil genius just is an example of your imagining a situation where your mind exists without your body or without your brain. You're imagining that all these things you see and feel, like your own legs, your own hands, brains in other people's brains and neurons, etc. You're imagining that all of that's just an illusion in your mind created by an evil genius. And so in that scenario, you're imagining that your mind exists without any physical body. In the video that I assigned you to watch, there's also that sort of mirror example where you're asked to imagine sort of waking up, sort of seeing your ceiling, and then sort of seeing sort of your hallway, and then you get into sort of bathroom, and you look in the mirror and you don't see any reflection, and you look down, you don't see any body, you don't have any arms to sort of touch it. Is if you can follow that story, even if it seems strange and spectacular, the fact that you can follow the story shows that you can imagine it. You can still conceive of that situation where your thoughts, your mind, are existing without your body. All right, so now premise 2 then says, well, if you can conceive of it, then that shows that it's possible. Well, why should we believe this? Well, this comes from the idea that conceivability is our best test of what is and is not possible. And so we have those previous examples that we discussed earlier, like the 100-foot book, jumping over a skyscraper, Mary Basher, round square. Those examples offer some support to the quality of the conceivability test. The fact that we can conceive of those first two shows that they are possible. The fact that we cannot conceive of the second two, the last two, shows that they are impossible. All right, so what about premise 4 then? This says, if the mind just is the body or brain, then it would be impossible for the mind to exist without the body. Well, this is just a law of logic. If A equals B, then you can't have one without the other. So something cannot exist without itself. I mean, you only have one thing there, and that one thing can't exist without that one thing. I mean, as an example, it's impossible for there to be a situation where the Mona Lisa exists, but the Mona Lisa does not exist. It's also impossible for there to be a situation where your brain exists, but your brain does not exist. Similarly, if your mind just is your brain, then it's also impossible for there to be any situation where your mind exists without your brain. All right, so that motivates each of these premises we need to understand Descartes' conceivability argument. In the next video, we're going to be discussing some of the worries and some of the replies that physicalists have given to try to avoid Descartes' dualism. See you then.